I want to introduce you in this philosophy of Max Scheler, starting with his anthropology. The thesis of him is the man is first an emotional being. Ens amans, he used this Latin expression, before becoming volitional being, ens volens, before finally becoming a being who knows ens cogitans. So Scheler have a focus on a different dimension of our human being, and this crucial one is the emotional dimension of our life. From this emotional sphere or a dimension emerged the volitional one. We have wills act, we want to act in the world, and the third one is the as the human as ens cogitans, as a rational being. With this anthropological perspective is referred the other one, the psychological perspective. Rafał, please.
I hate to interrupt, but we have to keep in mind the track of time.
Okay. So my time is over. Yes.
Like 2 minutes, Professor. If you would be kind to finish in 2 minutes, that would be perfect.
Okay. So in this psychology perspective, we have different emotional acts mentioned. You can find it in my presentation. Step further to psychological perspective. Rafał, please. Yes, and there we can find several kinds of collective social units, like mass, society, or collective person, culture, ecclesia, related to this emotional act. So it built a nice structure of micro and microcosmos, we can say. And to summarize this Scheller's approach, we can say the emotional source of we is his important achievement in this concept also of solitude, and second, this non-egological model of consciousness. Consciousness, it's not necessarily self-consciousness. And Rafał, please, we can go to the summarize, beginning with the question, are we really lonely? Are we really lonely? Yeah, thank you. It was this, the concept. Okay, I have to pick up the most important things. This way of describing loneliness allows us to look at it as a kind of atrophy of our emotional attention. The construction of man's loneliness, starting by their ens amans, ens cogitans, down to the level of ens volens and the level of emotionality ens amans, show them as a part rooted in a whole from which lonely individuals can get their strength. And maybe the last sentence, our epistemological individualism as a grandfather of loneliness. Thank you very much, and please excuse me for this long speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was fascinating, and I hope that we can discuss in the future something Shelley's ideas. So thank you very much for attending this panel. I'm afraid we are running out of time and have to make floor for the other panel starting in just a second. So which is going to be moderated by Professor Murawska. I'm really sorry that we don't really have time for discussing, but maybe afterwards we will have time for some questions. And I hope that we can put the questions in the chat box, so perhaps we can think about them, and persons who are presenting could perhaps answer them that way.
Excuse me. I'm afraid that the chat is, writing on chat is impossible. On this, we don't have this function. So sorry.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kate. Don't worry. We will. It is wonderful to have an overflowing of ideas and themes. We will make sure there is time to talk about these talks. And thank you, Kasia, as well, for your chairing and care in looking after this session. Can I suggest we should be starting the next session now, but just for comfort, so that people can get a drink or go to the toilet? Could I suggest that we have 5 minutes off now and start again in Polish time at 12:20 with the next panel, and that for the next panel, and I know Anna is chairing that, we stick to 15 minutes of wonderful, joyful presentations for each of the presentations. I know myself, I talk too much, and I know it is a sign of great generosity that people are wanting to talk. But let's see what we can do with the next session in 5 minutes. Is that okay, Anna, as well, and Gosia?
Yes, of course.
Yes, okay.
Thank you so much. So we'll leave the cameras, well, sorry, we'll leave the system on, but if you need to go and get yourself a coffee or something, then we'll start again in 5 minutes. Thank you.
O, Jarek, gdzie ty jesteś?
U siebie w pokoju.
No, ale
Ja
zginąłeś z ekranu. Gosia mnie tu dyscyplinowała, że ja mam włączoną kamerę. Na co ja mówię, że celowo, no to czekam na uczestników, więc dlatego nie wyłączałam kamery. Oni mnie tu dyscyplinują, że mam włączoną kamerę. Mówię ci po prostu, co tu jest za bezhołowie, że naprawdę. Miło
No
cię widzieć,
właśnie.
Jarku.
No ja też to właśnie przed chwilą napisałem, że
Tak?
miło cię widzieć, bo tak się słyszymy od czasu do czasu, a uśmiechnąć się do siebie nie ma okazji.
A gdzie napisałeś?
SMS-a wysłałem.
A ja z Gosią rozmawiałam, widzisz, bo ona mi tutaj głowę zawraca, widzę, więc ja odpowiadam, że również mi miło cię widzieć.
To jest gabinet szefowej tutaj, tak? W Szczecinie?
Tak, bardzo skromny, jak szefowa.
Tutaj wzywasz na dywanik wszystkich pracowników?
No. Ale tu jest ładnie, ja ci pokażę, tu są kanapy, to nawet widzisz kanapy?
No to
Widzisz
faktycznie,
kanapy?
tak, widzę, to
No,
jest
także-
faktycznie zupełnie inna atmosfera.
Trącę się, przepraszam, na stole są słodycze.
O, widzisz. Panie Alku, śliwka w
Tak
czekoladzie. To
Tak
zapraszam, bo żurawinę w czekoladzie wydziubałam przed chwilą.
To zaraz będę.
Okej.
Zapraszam.
Ale widzę, że Szczecin po prostu w dobrej atmosferze i
Dzień dobry pani Julio, przepraszam Jarku, bo to pani Julia to młoda pani doktor, moja doktorantka.
No
Ja
to
mogę dodać
gratuluję.
do tej historii, że u pani profesor też bardzo dobrą kawę dają, także same luksusy.
Także generalnie to jest gabinet gastronomiczny, wiesz?
Chciałam też zapytać, korzystając z tej sekundy czasu jeszcze, ponieważ za ścianą się tutaj odbywają zajęcia muzyczne i zastanawiałam się, czy jeżeli ten fortepian będzie grał, a chór będzie śpiewał, czy będzie to też słychać i dla Państwa będzie słyszalne, ale akurat jak ja się uruchomiłam, to chór zamilkł, więc zestresowałam się. O, jest i śliwka w czekoladzie.
Julio, przenieś się do gabinetu Basi Chojnackiej,
To znaczy,
będzie słychać.
Słuchajcie, jeżeli będzie coś słychać, to będzie to bardzo miłe. Julian cały czas uruchamia nam dzwony na wieży kościoła. W związku z tym, dlaczego by z Polski nie miały dobiegać jakieś inne dźwięki? Prawda?
Fortepian gra pięknie.
Dzień dobry, Basiu.
No.
Wszyscy obecni.
Został wywołany. Julia, tu jest naprawdę fajnie, jest druga Basia ze mną, także...
No,
Ale fajnie macie, a ja tu sama.
Zapraszamy.
po prostu szaleństwo. No ale widzę, że takie przyjazne to miejsce jest ten Szczecin, tak?
Bardzo.
No już aż tyle razy byłeś zapraszany i w ogóle nie korzystasz z tego zaproszenia.
Zgłosiłem się na
stałe.
konferencję 2 razy, a za każdym razem odwołujecie stacjonarne. No to co ja mam o tym sobie myśleć? Co?
To ze względu na ciebie odwołujemy, wiesz, żebyś nie przyjechał.
Żebym nie przyjechał. No właśnie. Cześć Małgosiu. A Małgosia też w pracy siedzi.
Wszyscy, wiesz co? Chyba większość z nas jest w pracy tutaj w instytucie, bo tu jest tak fajnie, że po prostu my tu przyjeżdżamy.
Od samego świtu.
Bo nasza
Od
kochana
samego świtu.
pracunia.
No, a na pewno dlatego, że lubicie jeździć po Szczecinie. Bo teraz tam tych dróg tam wam różnych takich naprodukowali i można jechać coraz szybciej do tego Szczecina i macie trasy szybkiego ruchu i tak dalej. I autostrady i do Niemiec i tak dalej.
Wiesz co, tak w centrum. Blisko
Tak,
pracy.
to znaczy Szczecin jest w centrum Europy. To trzeba powiedzieć, że Szczecin ma dobrą lokalizację. Można przypłynąć i Julian, hello. I understand we have to start speaking in English.
I think so, and I think that Julian tried to discipline us because according to my watch, it is 22 past 12. So we should have started 2 minutes ago. But I can see only one speaker, who is Julia Karapuda. Oh, Emmy is with us. And Eric. Okay, hello, nice to see you. And we are waiting for Elżbieta. Oh, Elżbieta is with us. Hello. And Helen. I don't know where Helen is, or if Helen is.
I haven't seen Helen all morning, and I'm worried that she might not be with us. Can I suggest that you put her to the end in the last position?
Okay.
If
she joins us.
I think she joins us. I will email her now, just to see.
So as we have the problem with being on time, I suggest to start if you don't mind. So once again, hello to everyone, and thank you for joining us for the session. And I'm convinced that it will be well spent time, as we have 5 interesting speakers and 5 interesting presentations. And we've got Helen Lees from UK and Italy. We've got Eric Schoenmakers. Sorry, Eric, if I do not pronounce your surname properly.
It's well enough, thank you.
And Elżbieta Dubas from Szczecin, Emmy Webster from United Kingdom, and Elżbieta Dubas from Poland. Sorry, Elżbieta. And Emmy Webster from United Kingdom, and Julia Karapuda from Poland as well. And as Helen Lees, we do not know if she is with us, so I follow Julian's suggestion, and we start from the presentation of Eric Schoenmakers. And as it was before, I suggest we have presentation, 15 minutes presentations, and at the end of the session we will have 15 minutes or maybe even more to discuss presentation that will be presented. So we start from Eric Schoenmakers from Netherlands. With the presentation, that subject is what students need to not feel lonely. And Eric, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. I would say Schoenmakers is my surname, but it's a difficult one to pronounce. So,
sorry, very sorry for that.
So no need to worry about that. I will set my alarm so I can keep track of time, and I'll share my screen, hopefully, like this. Okay. So thanks for organizing this event. I'm very happy to participate so far. It's my first time in this group of people. So I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Eric Schoenmakers. I work in the Netherlands at Monash University of Applied Sciences. I'm a researcher. We have a bachelor and master's program for students in gerontology, healthy aging, and as a researcher, I am interested in the topic of loneliness. I've been studying loneliness since I think 28 or 29, something like that. And so far it has been focused on older adults mainly, but for my current research project, I'm studying students. And so far in this interesting conference, I've heard many big ideas about loneliness and solitude, and my presentation will concern small data, individuals, and how they experience their lives, their social relationships, and feelings of loneliness. So I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts about how my observations link to your ideas. Well, loneliness has been, I think, a very prominent topic in media and in research lately due to the pandemic. And I'm not sure how this is in Poland or in the UK or anywhere else, but in the Netherlands we have a lot of gaining interest, growing interest for loneliness among young people, which I think is very interesting. This study is part of a larger program in which I'm interested in relationship standards based on the cognitive discrepancy theory, in which I'm very interested in whether and how it works. So I'm gonna talk to you about that. Cognitive discrepancy theory is very simple in its basic. It's pronounced as loneliness is the perceived gap between the quality of and also the quantity of relationships someone has and someone wants. And by this definition, loneliness is always a negative thing. So it's not the same as solitude or being alone. It's a perceived gap, a gap that's not, that someone does not want. It's subjective. As a researcher or a professional, I would not be the one to decide whether the gap is there and how it feels. It's up to the person. And it's of quality and quantity of relationships, but actually it's all sorts of characteristics about relationships. And I was interested in this, so thinking about cognitive discrepancy theory, you can think of it as a weighing scale, which a side of the relationships people want and the relationships people has. And as a weighing scale, if I would want more things of social relationships, I would make that part of the scale heavier by expectations of relationships, the things I want, social norms, things I see on social media, and so on. There are a lot of things that can make that side of the scale heavier. And if I would want to not feel lonely, I would have to make the has side of the scale also more heavy by adding more, better, more frequent contacts, and that sort of things. So alternatively, there would be two ways of coping with loneliness. You can either have more, so you can make the scale more heavier, as I explained, or as the picture probably explains. But you can also want less of the social norms, of the expectations, all that sort of things. And I think when we think about loneliness and we think about interventions, we would typically think about adding more to the has scale, adding more relationships, adding more time with people, adding more quality to relationships, but we would hardly think about wanting less. And wanting less sounds very negative, but it's not necessarily so. It's not wanting less, it's wanting different things, and having another perspective on the things we want. So an easy example would be if I would be in love with someone who would not be in love with me. I could very much want that, but it will never happen. So instead, over time, this time has a lot of, I think time is very important in this construct. Over time, I will probably learn to be happy with another relationship with that person, a more friendly relationship, or I would move on and want different things. So, and there's of course always the option of ignoring the discrepancy, the gap between the things we want and have, and just do different things like watching television or going out or doing other stuff, not to think about this gap. So that's so in this study, I'm interested in the one side of this weighing scale, but you cannot look at one side of the scale without looking at the other one as well. But my focus is on the one side, and what I did was I had a research question, which is, what do young adults or students need in order to not feel lonely? In other words, what are their relationship standards? What is it that they want, and how does this look? What are the norms and the values? What are the quantity of relationships, the qualities, the roles you play in the lives of others? And for this, we did 31 qualitative interviews with students. I say we because I had 2 student assistants, student researchers who I trained to do the interviews with me, which was very insightful because they can level with students in another way that as a lecturer I can. We included a lot of, about 30% of the interviews is with people from a different ethnicity than the Dutch ethnicity. And I had one student researcher who was from Aruba, and she could very well level with the students and talk in the same language, very good. So we had 31 qualitative interviews, and we discussed whether the students, the young adults felt lonely, what their relationships look like, what is essential to them, because we all have a lot of relationships that are maybe important but not essential to not feel lonely. And now I'm in the thorough, painful exercise of coding all of this and categorizing all of this. So I'm going to introduce you to some first results of the study, but it's an ongoing process. So your ideas would be very welcome at the end. Okay, so I made this model about how this would maybe work, how would this, what this looks like, and I'm going to zoom in first on the part to the right, the lonely, not lonely part, and the life events related to that. This was not how I set out this study, because I was really interested in the upper side of this part, the relationships of this model, but I think it relates to feeling lonely or not. So we did not ask of our participants in the study before whether they felt lonely or not. This was not an inclusion criteria. We just wanted to talk to people about their social relationships. But what was interesting is that all students, all respondents have felt lonely from one time or the other, at one time or the other. I was not really surprised by this because if you look at the loneliness numbers in the Netherlands, but in different countries, the percentages are so high, and we know that loneliness can be a very state-like condition. You can feel lonely for a short time. It almost has to mean that everybody knows the feeling of loneliness, which makes sense, I guess. But what was more surprising was that all respondents were willing to talk about feeling lonely and how this felt, and when they felt lonely, how this experience felt. It's very easy to talk about with them. And of course, there's a lot of range in duration, severity, intensity of the feeling. Some students have felt lonely a long time and very intensely, while others had episodes of loneliness, but very manageable and very for a short time. And loneliness here is always a negative experience. So we asked about that. It's not about being alone or solitude, solitary, but it's always the negative feeling with that. But almost everybody we spoke to reflected in hindsight on loneliness as being a time, a chance for self-reflection and learning what is important to them for their social relationships. And most of the students had very heavy life events they have been through. They lost parents, they had parents breakups, divorcing, but also lost loved ones, friends who did suicide, and so many students had very intense life events. I think we often tend to forget about that these people are so young, but they have a lot of issues in their baggage. And of course, there was COVID-19, which was a very intense trigger for many, and the measures, the lockdown measurements regarding COVID-19. But also they mention having a lack of personal skills, a lack of time, a distance between them and the people they would want to, as reasons for feeling lonely. So loneliness is caused by life events, but that's never the entire story, because one person would lose someone one person's parents would get in divorce and he would become lonely, while another one would lose their head, would be in the same situation but would not feel lonely. So there's something interpersonal going on, and there's something in the relationships going on. So we asked about the relationships they had, and what was again, not very surprising, which social sciences often tends not to be very surprising in hindsight, but was still interesting to hear that parents, and especially mothers, are essential for young people. Not very surprising, but they were more important than their best friends, more important than their romantic partners, more important than their school peers in terms of not feeling lonely. Shared time, having a history together was very important, which you often have with your parents, and shared experiences. And also, but this was more with friends, shared norms and values and shared interests. We had some students mentioning that they liked diversity in their network and people who were very different, but most of them really wanted just somebody who they understood and who understood them. So this is very much about emotional, satisfying relationships. Another part of loneliness would be feeling part of a group and fitting in a group. But most students say, well, this is nice, but it's less essential for my feeling lonely than the intimate contact with a mother in most cases.
I'm terribly sorry, Eric, but you've got 1 minute left.
Yeah, I know. I have 1 minute and 30
if you can
seconds.
go to the end, it would be nice.
Yeah, I'm finishing up. Then there's intra-individual results. Most students show reflective and coping skills, and they actually learn from episodes of loneliness. So while feeling lonely, they change their expectations of their relationships. And this helps them feeling less lonely, learning about loneliness, or not feeling lonely anymore. So loneliness is not a nice experience, but it teaches them a lot of things. And I guess time is very important here, because this learning is always in hindsight. It's always looking back on a situation. And culture is also very important, context. Because that would mean that you would have shared norms and values. So, conclusions. I think cognitive descriptive theory is a useful way of looking at balance in relationships, and young adults are learning what they need in relationships from feeling lonely. They really get the chance to rethink and change their relationships and their networks. And being solitude from time to time really helps. So helping them with loneliness. Again, I think everybody knows the feeling of loneliness. It can sometimes be useful, but it's never nice. The existing relationships are very important, and especially the mothers. So in terms of intervention, you could help young adults in learning from loneliness, making the learning experience more available, because learning is hard, as we all know. And we can help young adults in nourishing existing important contexts, which is very different from the approach which we commonly use to introduce new contexts and that sort of things. So in other words, we can either help them have more, but also wanting less. Okay, so to finish up, I'm doing the same qualitative study with a group of older adults and working on an intervention to reflect on the relationship expectations. And if you're interested, please be in touch. So, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Eric, especially for giving us a nice model of understanding feeling lonely or not feeling or feeling no lonely. So thank you a lot, and I think that in the last part of our session we'll have questions for you, And now I would like to ask Elżbieta Dubas to present her research. And I forgot to mention before that we concentrate in that session on loneliness in education, and it was in Eric's presentation and now in Elżbieta Dubas' presentation that is titled Learning in of Solitude in the Context of Pedagogical Monotheology. Elżbieta, welcome you, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. Hello, dear colleagues. It is for me a big pleasure to be in this society, with very net and important people we think about research in areas of solitude. Thank you. My last interest is learning solitude. I am andragogist, also I research solitude as a learning process. This problem, learning solitude, I give in this moment in the context of pedagogical monotheology. Monotheology, it is the science of solitude, a part of various scientific areas and disciplines. It is, for example, in philosophy of solitude, or monotheosophy, Domeracki Piotr, and in pedagogy, education, pedagogical monotheology, previously as pedagogy of solitude. It is reflection and research into solitude, place it in the context of educational processes. Realized by scientists dealing with education, for example, pedagogists, andragogists, geragogists, and others. Yes, thank you, Rafał. Next slide. Rafał, yes. I see two most important terms of pedagogical monotheology. The first is solitude, very broadly understood, and learning, very broadly understood too, as formal education, non-formal education, and informal learning as part of life. Solitude is a phenomenon, universal phenomenon of human existence, also relationship of being together and alone, which should coexist and oscillate between each other. Next slide. Pedagogical monotheology research solitude problems in the institutions, for example, at school and outside of an institution, for example, in family and so. And in all periods of development, also from childhood to old age, with various paradigms and methodological orientation, various methods and research techniques. Next. Next slide, please. Solitude, learning solitude, after my research, I see important four areas, terms. Also participating in adult education understood as institution. It was very, very important strategy in coping in solitude, and self-learning, self-education, and now learning in solitude and learning of solitude. it is a process andragogists characterize this process of learning of solitude in 4 spaces: social and emotional learning, learning from one's biography, existential learning, and transformative learning. Methodology, it is important. This is the perspective of research, andragogical, time May-June 2021. On participants, the threshold of adulthood, that is by andragogists, the first 11 level in adulthood. Also, this was participants between 80 and 25 years old. And the next, very interesting is that all of the study subjects declared that they experienced loneliness in the past. Currently, however, this does not concern them. Loneliness in the past for all difficulties in the family, limitation or lack of contact with the close ones, and difficulties in relationship with peers. Loneliness in the past, it is related to the period of growing up and the time of junior high school education. Current experiences with loneliness primarily concern the following: no closest people around and the situation on coronavirus pandemic. The main topic in my research now is the connection between solitude and learning. And which is this connection? And now the analysis of empirical material. 2/3 of the studied subject see the connection between solitude and learning. Most frequently, it is learning in solitude, also in the situation of being alone. Less frequent, it is learning of solitude, also learning about being alone. And this material, empirical material, shows several main categories of learning in or of solitude. Now I will explain shortly each category. Next, please. Getting to know oneself is reflected as learning oneself. I was learning myself who I am. I'm not the center of the universe. The outcomes of this learning is expanded self-awareness. Next, open up to others. Very important relationship between alone and together. Very important type of education. For example, appreciating their presence in our life. Next, the ability to be alone with oneself. Also, I learned to be alone with my thought, with myself. It's very important skill, particularly when there are no other people around. Next, balancing the relationship of alone and together. It is a type of golden means between opening up to others and the ability to be with oneself. For example, so being once means a lot to me, but so does contact with another person, which I cannot forget about. Next, coping with difficulties, which appears when we are alone, prepares us to face and handle similar situations in a better way. Very important is living independently. I learned how to deal with small problems myself and being condemned to being alone. And next, changes regarding to philosophy of life. Being alone makes people aware of the fact that we should appreciate what we have. Being alone is a good lesson of humility. Life is beautiful, so we should live beautiful. This is a profound notion that comes from meditation after the experienced solitude. And last, changes regarding understanding the phenomenon of solitude. Also, experiencing solitude depends understanding solitude. The young people find positive side of solitude. Solitude might also be chosen by a person, and this thought, I am not the center of this universe, and so. And next slide. For me, it was very important too, the connection between being alone and formal education. And it is really very important, this big transfer from junior high school to high school. Learning for the exams, for exam, maturity exams at the university, educating to become an IT specialist. For 5 terms, I had been studying IT, where I actually never meet any new people. IT geeks are not usually very sociable. And online learning during the pandemic. And next, please. We can tell about character of learning solitude reflected in the study. This learning solitude is learning from all life's experience and doing so subconsciously. It is informal learning. It has transformative character and is a dynamic process modified through solitude, loneliness. And excuse me. Yes, here we have a notion used by the study subject which are related to learning solitude. For example, understanding oneself, understanding something, learning oneself, learning something alone, getting to know oneself, thinking, drawing conclusions, coping with difficult. They are primarily verb phrases in their statements. This points the activity, taking action on processes. And next, a few key message which may become an indicator for others. Very important for me was life is beautiful, so you've got life beautifully. Or it is solitude needed in everyone's life in order to reflect. This is a new situation which teaches us new things, and so. And next, please. Selected examples of situation of learning solitude. For example, also it is, for example, about learning solitude. Solitude teaches a beautiful life. It is this example. The first, the positive and the chosen solitude. Solitude teaches reflexivity, coping with being alone. Solitude teaches independence and appreciation of closest ones. And So loneliness is an accumulation of many difficulties, being away from homeland and family, education abroad, the pandemic situation. Central statement, I was lived alone in Poland. Solitude teaches life in a difficult reality, in appreciation for the family. And last, loneliness at school. School education, pandemic, online learning, modern technologies, central statements. Loneliness lets you draw conclusions after all. I feel really lonely before exams. When I spend all days in front of the computer with my girlfriend, even though the flat is small, it still feels separate and not together. Loneliness teaches in this situation behavior in the future. And conclusions from research, yes. East mostly experienced solitude as a difficult and painful experience, as loneliness, with many reasons. But the young people see positive sides of loneliness too. Loneliness is shaped by a person, speaking about learning in solitude. It is informal learning, and we can see about fruitful trajectories in learning solitude. It is, by example, reflexivity, and about transformation too. And for all, I must tell this, it is existential learning, and very good is connected with 4 primary categories of existential philosophy, connected with pedagogy. Very important in learning solitude. It is individuality, choice, being in a situation and becoming. Recommendation for all, the last is to end. Bringing back to multifaceted understanding of the phenomenon of solitude may be the key for modern education, which should support people in difficult times, pandemic, war, unpredictable changes. For me, this research brings very big surprise. This surprise was reflexivity of these young people. It is my hope for the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elżbieta, for your interesting presentation, especially for showing us solitude and loneliness and occasion for learning, and as an area for learning as well. And now I would like to ask Amy Webster to present her presentation, Children Reading Alone and Reading Together, Literature, Representation and the Lesson from a Pandemic. Amy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Anna. I'll just try and share my screen. So can you see that okay?
Yes, it is okay. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. So I am also new to this group, so I'd never really explored solitude and loneliness, and so it was very welcome when I started discussing it with Julian, and the opportunity it gave to apply a new lens to some of the topics and areas that I work on. So just a little bit about my background, which probably explains the perspective that I come to this topic from. So I have a background in education, but particularly within that, I focus on literacy and reading, a particular emphasis on children's literature. I did some of my doctoral research looking at children's classics, and I've broadened that out to think about literacy curricula and issues around reading too. Coming from the UK context, as I started off as a trained primary school teacher. So I approached this topic of solitude from the perspective of education and English as well, with the lens of children's literature and literacy. So today I'm going to talk a little bit, starting off with some of the English context, looking at some of the literary representations of children and young people reading alone, playing on this particular trope of the child being immersed in a book. And I'm then going to shift from literary children and readers to real readers by thinking about the context of children's reading experiences from school and what can be learned from their experiences during the pandemic. So I'm going to start off with quite a famous children's text, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. And children's literature, when you start to look at it, is full of characters who are immersed in books. So it's never a lens that I'd applied to some of the texts that I'd studied. I thought a lot about kind of their classic qualities and how they get adapted and re-illustrated for children, but never really the children in them and their own encounters with reading. So one of the most famous books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, it begins with, or really even because of, how Alice is excluded from her sister's encounter with the book. So the story begins, Alice was beginning to get very tired of sitting by her sister on the bank and of having nothing to do. Once or twice she had peeped into the book her sister was reading, but it had no pictures or conversations in it. And what is the use of a book, thought Alice, without pictures or conversations? And the story then progresses when suddenly a white rabbit with pink eyes ran close by her. So you can see that Alice's sister is immersed in the text and ignoring Alice. Her sister is not physically alone, as Alice is there present with her, but mentally she is. And I've shown two depictions of this scene. The first one at the top from the new re-illustrated version of Alice by Helen Oxenbury, and a screenshot below from Disney's film version. You see that both characters are physically present, so Alice is there with her sister, but the sister is in her own world of the book, immersed and excluding Alice as well. And this links to a point that was expressed by the Italian writer Italo Calvino in his book If on a Winter's Night a Traveller, and he said that reading is solitude. One reads alone, even in another's presence. Conversely, Alice is not physically alone, but she also feels that she is because her sister is mentally absent. This constructed sense of loneliness allows Alice's mind to wander and to catch a glimpse of a late running rabbit, which sparks her foray into Wonderland. So I move from Alice's sister to another young woman in children's literature who's constantly being represented as being immersed in a book. And I showed two different versions of this work. So looking at the text, Beauty and the Beast, and Beaumont's version, the two eldest, two sisters, went out every day to parties of pleasure, balls, plays, concerts, and so forth. And they laughed at their younger sister because she spent the greatest part of her time in reading good books. And Cummins argues that Beaumont emphasises Belle's love of music and books, creating a heroine who is a reading woman. And this was an important concept at a time when the general population was only just becoming a reading population, and when literary heroines represented a new kind of female protagonist, one who thinks and learns. And the immersion is evident there from the text, you know, the greatest part of her time, the physical time, but also an interesting kind of aside is the notion that it wasn't just the reading, but she was reading good books, another way of differentiating her from her surroundings and the people in her community. Most famous to many children are Disney's versions of these texts, because of kind of a concept of Disneyfication that started around the mid-20th century. A lot of these texts have been taken by Disney and transformed. So when I talk about these texts with children in lessons, often they're most familiar with Disney's version that has taken the original, put their own spin on it by moving from a verbal text, a written one, to a visual text. There are many different considerations that are employed in the visual depiction of the original text, and also the addition of different modes of telling, so the use of audio and song and gesture in there. So the text that's shown there is an extract from the film when the men are saying about Belle, "Look, there she goes, that girl is so peculiar. I wonder if she's feeling well." The women reply with a dreamy, far-off look, and the men finish, "and her nose stuck in a book," as well. So Belle is repeatedly referred to as a bookworm and a book lover, and actually the film's text shows some negative attitudes towards the trope of a bookworm and having your head stuck in a book. And it's something that still persists today. When talking about children, their reading habits as well, and many of them mention how they might be called a bookworm and how that makes them feel in a negative sense, that, you know, they enjoy being immersed in a book, but they're always conscious of how that appears to other people and how it can be looked more favourably on by the adults around them, by less so than their peers as well. So Belle is often depicted as being physically on her own with a book, such as at her father's house, but she is often also shown as being immersed in a text even when she is surrounded by people. And the two images there are stills from the film version that show the extent of Belle being surrounded by people, so not physically alone, but again how the book and how engaging with the text created the sense of being alone as well. And there's an additional notion here of how reading is shown as a mean of escapism and a way to feel less alone as well. Again, Belle is surrounded by people, but they are not very much like her. They're shown as having a small town mentality, being materialistic and old-fashioned in terms of their gender roles. So reading is a way to escape that. And finally, a third literary representation, probably one of the most famous child readers in children's literature, which is that of Matilda. The books transported her into new worlds and introduced her to amazing people who lived exciting lives. She travelled all over the world while sitting in her little room in an English village. So the extent to which Matilda immerses herself in a text is evident. It kind of explains the journeys that she goes on. And Matilda tries to spend all the time that she has being at home with the books in the safety of her bedroom. And she wants to spend as much time and put as much physical space as possible between herself and her family. And this is a quote from Matilda's mother. She spends her life up in her room, buried in some silly book. Writing about Matilda's literary practices, Pucci highlights how Matilda's reading can be classified as an act to be able to escape from her real world. And from that point, he goes on to argue that all reading can offer this escapism for the reader. And even when Matilda can't be physically alone, when there's enforced TV viewings or mealtimes, she tries to use books to remove herself from that situation and to be mentally alone or somewhere else. So this final quote is where Matilda is sitting reading and her father comes in and turns on the TV, and Matilda keeps right on reading. And Pucci argues that by reading the book, Matilda can distance herself from her family's activity. Whilst her body is in the living room with the family member who has put the TV on, her soul and her mind have travelled to the world inside the story and experienced the journey of the character inside the book she reads. Again, she is shutting out the noise of her environment through reading and through creating a sense of being alone. That noise is actually a physical noise, the noise of the television, the conversation of her family, but it's also a bit more of a figurative noise, or the unspoken views that her family have around how she should behave and what she should do as well. And this links to the other characters we've seen in terms of how reading allows her to be less alone and to be herself as well. So moving from fictional children to child readers, these representations can act in a self-reflexive way, as the image of the literary child immersed in a book can draw in the child reader outside of the book. A famous theorist of children's literature, Jacqueline Rose, writes a lot about the representation of the child in children's literature and the power relations between adult writers and child readers as well. So Rose highlights the power dynamics in children's literature and how children's fiction can set up the child as an outsider and then aims to take the child in. Rose says this because children's literature rests on the power dynamics between the adult writer, who tries to write about children, and how the aim is to take the child reader in. We're going to continue thinking about real child readers and children's experiences in education within the UK context. So it was only when reflecting on children's reading experiences in education that I realised how so many of them are shared experiences. So children read to other people. There's a practice of shared reading where children are shown how to read a text and how to interact with it, and the teacher models this process with a group of children. And there's also guided reading, where children are guided through the text and taught how to extract meaning from it. And both of these reading practices take place in groups, often of children of the same reading ability, but they're shared reading experiences. Children are not alone with the texts. Children also constantly have one-to-one reading to practice their reading skills. This happens in the context of the home and the school. So we've got a whole group of shared reading experiences where children read to other people. But equally, children are also read to. Another way of thinking of shared reading, both in literacy lessons and at story times, children experience the text by it being shared from someone else, be it an adult or a peer as well. So the policy requirements set out in the national curriculum in our country can mean that these reading experiences in schools are often shared rather than solitary ones. So the national curriculum makes constant reference to how children should be given lots of opportunities to read to, to be read to, or to listen to stories and be read to in the context of other people. And actually, just as kind of an aside, when I was searching the national curriculum, I searched for the word alone in the national curriculum for England, and it didn't come up once in the literacy area. The word alone is never mentioned. There is no reference to children reading alone. It is mentioned that children need to gain skills so that they can read on their own, but this reading for themselves takes place in the context of sharing it with adults or in the context of home environments as well. There is never any mention or kind of endorsement that children should simply be alone with a book. And this reflects many of the aims of the policy perspective on what children need to be effective readers. There's been a lot in the United Kingdom about the teaching of early reading and how this should happen through the role of phonics, and how children need to practice their word recognition skills, and they also need to practice their reading comprehension skills as well. And this has led to a particularly strong emphasis on the skills and knowledge that children need as opposed to their own experiences with text. And again, this is linked to the national assessments, where now in year 1, children have to do a phonics screening check, and in year 2, they are assessed on their reading comprehension and on their year 6 experience as well. So reading experiences in primary education are characterised by being shared ones as opposed to solitary ones. So turning now to children's reading during a pandemic, there's a study by Professor Keith Topping that's conducted annually that explores children's reading habits. And what Topping found was that there was a positive change in enjoyment over the pandemic. So in 2020, 47.3% of children said that they enjoyed reading, and this was the lowest that had ever been since the survey started. Contrast to 2021, where 55.9% found that they enjoyed reading. And a number of reasons were given for this increased enjoyment. The first of all that Topping highlighted was that children had more time to read and to become immersed in a story. And it was never mentioned in this report, but from engaging with it, I then thought that the unspoken comment here is that children simply had more time to be alone with a book. Reading was also given as a way to counteract boredom. The pandemic led to children going back to books and changing their literacy practices. Children highlighted that they had increased autonomy and choice around what to read and the purpose as well. They were able to read for their own sake without having to answer questions or analyse texts. And around 60% of children and young people said during lockdown that reading made them feel better as well. It said that reading made them feel better when they were feeling sad because they could not see their family and friends. So reading offered a refuge. It provided calm, escapism, and relaxation. But it's important to highlight that there were some nuances. Some children highlighted that actually they had a lack of access to books because schools and libraries were closed, and this limited their ability to read. And also there wasn't a marked improvement in the reading enjoyment of boys. It actually had the opposite compared to the reading enjoyment of girls. So in order for these benefits for children to have more time to become immersed in a story and to escape, they actually do need the access to these texts. So a few quotes that link these reasons that have been given for the enjoyment in reading. At home, I can be myself and read, write and listen to what I want and need to by myself and not get interrupted. This links to the more time to read and to become immersed in a story and the increased autonomy and choice that children had over the text that they could read. I am more able to choose what I want to read without any pressure for having to analyse and write lots of essays. It's actually quite a harsh criticism of the current approach to reading. It casts that in a critical light. The idea of reading is often positioned as to analyse a book or to write about it rather than simply to become immersed in the story as well. I think before I read because I was made to. When the coronavirus came, I was bored and I started to read. Now I read because I like to read. That shift in reading habits due to the pandemic situation as well. It is more important than ever to read books and go into fictional worlds because we can't really go outside and do much in real life at the moment. This links to the point about how reading allowed for increased well-being and also the escape that books can provide. There also seems to be a connection here to feeling less alone, how fictional worlds populated with fictional beings offer company, and that by being alone with a book, children seem to feel less alone. So finally, a few lessons to take away from some of these findings and the explorations of literary representations. Topping argued that from these findings that children should have more opportunities to read in school, and I would just take that a step further and say that children should have more opportunities in school to be alone with books. Children have plenty of opportunities to be read to and to read to others, but the experience of being alone with books is still often absent in schools as well. Recognising the value of reading for well-being and how it could offer a particularly useful tool for students to encountering difficult situations, giving children greater choice about what to read, and also allowing children to read without this being linked to a learning objective or task as well. And this connects to a huge movement in children's literature studies about reading for pleasure, and how allowing children to read simply for the sake of reading and because they want to has a number of benefits. It has educational benefits in terms of reading attainment and writing. It helps children with their vocabulary and helps children to foster positive attitudes, which again improves their attainment as well. It also has a wide range of broader benefits that are not directly educational, but still incredibly important. More opportunities for reading for pleasure can allow great self-confidence as a reader. It allows a greater understanding of different cultures and periods of time, and it can also provide a greater insight into human nature and decision-making. So this talk started by exploring some literary representations of children reading alone and the trope of a child immersed in a book. By then considering children's solitary reading experiences during the pandemic, it has been argued that much can be gained from these solitary reading experiences. And actually there are some positives that can be taken forward to an experience that for children in many other aspects of their lives was an incredibly negative one. It would seem important that children have more opportunities in school to be alone with books and to become immersed in text, as actually, and very interestingly, what emerged when I was engaging with these ideas was that in being physically on their own with books, children seem to feel less alone as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Tammy. Thank you for taking us to our childhood and remind us our favorite books and what is most interesting to underline the meaning of reading for protecting ourselves from feeling lonely. And I noticed that Helen Lis is with us. Helen, are you with us?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Hello, Helen. Nice to see you. And I wonder if you don't mind if we left your presentation for the end of the session. As we decided to realize the order that was suggested by organizers, and then the floor will be yours after the last presentation. Yeah. Okay. Thank you a lot. So now I would like to ask Julia Karapuda from Poland, from Szczecin University, to present a speech, and the subject is teachers' loneliness in the process of assessing students' behavior. Okay, Julia, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you very much. Hello, everybody. I have a little problem with my presentation. I couldn't do nothing. I need help, I think. One moment, please.
So maybe it is possible to send it to Rafał Iwański, and Rafał present it instead of you, to help you that way.
It will be
one minute. I go to the Julia.
Rafał, w zasadzie nie wiem, dlaczego nie mogę tego udostępnić. Mam pulpit, mam udostępnić, przesyłam, nie udaje się.
Otwórz na swoim komputerze prezentację. Jakbyś prowadziła zajęcia, tak samo. Julia, w którym pokoju jesteś?
W setce. A teraz?
Okay,
Moment,
I can see your presentation. Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry for
But
this.
now we see your screen, not the okay, it's okay now.
It's okay. Okay, I'm sorry. Very sorry. One more time. Hello. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to talk about teacher loneliness in the process of assessing students' behavior. I worked in elementary school for 10 years. During the course on my teaching practice, an early school, early childhood education teacher, I were numerous questions arising regarding assessment, particularly the assessment of students' behavior. These questions included whether or not students' behavior in general should be assessed in school. Does a teacher have a right to pass a judgment of whether a student is a good or a bad person? Addition, it was a challenge for me in my early years to comply with all the laws and regulations that pertain to the rules for evaluating students' behavior. As a result, I started looking for answers to the questions I was stating. I analyzed theoretical studies, research results, and observed the course and dynamics of people involved in promoting the actions of teaching without grades on social media. However, the studies and research findings analyzed we mainly concerned with subject-based assessment and lacked theory on assessing students' behavior. In early childhood education, that analyzed and conducted did not answer all the questions I was asking at the time. Consequently, I undertook a study on teachers' practices of assessing students' behavior in early childhood, which I conducted in preparation for my doctoral dissertation. The overall goal of my study was to describe and systematize teacher practices for assessment behavior in early childhood education and to develop recommendation for teachers in this area. The aim of my study was to answer the main questions. What are teacher practices for assessing students' behavior in early childhood education? I collect empirical material by conducting focus group interviews, observations, performing documents analysis and preparing an autoethnographic description. The study involved professionally active female teachers working in early childhood education in schools located in the city of Szczecin. I observed 33 hours of classes, and additionally I analyzed 100 school report cards, especially focusing on the part of them that deals with the annual behavior assessments. By organizing the empirical material, I was able to identify the 3 areas of teacher behavior assessment practices. These areas include assessing students' behavior, informing parents of students' behavior assessment, and improving teachers on educational work. In my presentation, I will address only the last area because it is here that I found, I believe, to be a cognitively interesting topic for further research, which concerns teacher loneliness in assessing student behavior. Polish educator Bogusława Gołębniak is convinced, and this is confirmed by the participants in my focus group interviews, that most teachers consider grading to be one of the most difficult activities in the classroom. Participants in the focus group interview indicated that objectivity, systematicity, consistency, and fairness were the most difficult factors in assessing student behavior. In their reports, the teachers emphasized that grading behavior is a difficult process that needs to be improved conditionally. My particular attention was drawn to these participant statements regarding feelings of loneliness is relation to giving behavior ratings to students. This is first example of such statements. And this is a second example. The teaching profession is most often associated with social mission, duty, vocation, and ethos. More often than in other professions, teachers have a close relationship between professional duties and moral obligations that are never ethically neutral. Alexandra Dens-Sadura points out that teachers have no one to talk about their experiences and the difficulties related to educational work. The author described this situation as loneliness in a teacher's room full of people. On the other hand, Jerzy Gałkowski stresses the burden of one's own decision, one's own conscience, and one's own responsibility cannot be borne by one's teacher, because it is alone in such situations, even with when you can consult someone, to ask someone for advice. Everyone experiences loneliness in their lives, although when considering this phenomenon, it is important to remember that everyone will feel and experience loneliness in an individual and subjective way. Many times it is the loneliness that facilitates reflection and a deeper entry into one's existence. It is just important and necessary for a person to function in society. Although it is not easy, teachers who evaluate behavior are able to resist criticism or pressure and dissatisfaction of students or their parents, or at least distance themselves from such situation in order to draw conclusions, resolve those, and assess students' behavior. It is loneliness, according to Jerzy Gałkowski. We find the deepest layer of our freedom. We are alone, and this is imposes the burden of loneliness. But on the other hand, we can say that we are alone, so we exist in the full independence of our conscience, of our decisions. Moreover, I find the statements of Małgorzata Wałęsa valuable. Loneliness should be looked at with the humility of teachers, keeping in internal complexity in mind. The author pointed out that the Polish languages has several words that are used interchangeably to describe loneliness, and each of these words has a slightly different meaning. It is worth noting that the first two concepts betray a possibility, positive dimensions of loneliness. In contrast, in English, two dissimilar words are distinguished to help highlight the meanings of loneliness and solitude. Accordingly, it would be worth looking into how do teachers understand their loneliness. Loneliness is a category that also appeared in research conducted by Krzysztof Polak on selected psychosocial context of teachers' sense of helplessness. More than 200 of 354 teachers participating in this study reported experiencing loneliness. Situations in which teachers feel isolated referred to problems with students of an educational nature, among other things. In my opinion, the statements of female teachers participating in my study indicating the teacher's feeling of loneliness when evaluating behavior, as well as the declarations of teachers participating in Krzysztof Polak's study describing the feeling of loneliness when solving educational problems with students, have a common denominator. the topic of teacher loneliness, and even more so the loneliness associated with ascetic students.
Julia, we are approaching to the end, so please say final comments and close the presentation.
This is different perspective on teachers' loneliness, and maybe now
please come to the conclusions, yeah, or
okay, keeping in mind how important and emotionally changed a topic it was for the teachers who participated in my research to describe their feelings of loneliness at the time of behavioral assessment. Given how few publications on research findings address issue, I believe that the issue raised here are up to date as well as useful for pedagogical theory and practice. It can be source of inspiration for further research. And it makes me state another open questions for the future. So maybe that's it. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you for showing us another dimension or another aspect of loneliness and education, the loneliness of experienced by teachers. Thank you a lot. And there is the time for Helen Lees. Helen is going to talk about broken unscientific arm of self-care in the context of silence and solitude for schools. Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Shall I take a little bit less time? So, because you want to have a discussion as well. So how much time shall I take?
In fact, each person had 15 minutes, but
I take 10? 5 or 10?
I think if it will be 12, it would be okay.
Okay, so I'll go for 10, and you know, right. So what I want to talk about is, in some way, the use of silence as an antidote for the construction of knowledge in terms of our understanding of what is to be known, and I'm presenting that in the context of academic presentations of a topic like this. Usually when we're talking about something in an academic context, we're using structures and we're presenting findings, and we're saying, this is what I found out, this is what we know, this is what other people know, and here are some things for us to consider, or things to apply, or things to do, practices that we can forward that makes the world a better place, etc. What I'm presenting here, however, is completely different in that it's a puzzle. And it's a puzzle of a kind which silence is very good at creating or allowing us to access. But it's complicated by the idea that actually silence, which I think possibly could all consider to be a benefit, a possible benefit, may be something else as well. And obviously it all depends on the structures that we're using to understand silence, but also to experience silence. What is it doing? What is its purpose? And there I'm talking about structures that enclose silence and make it something that we can recognize as possibly scientific. So for instance, if a study were to be done on meditation and mindfulness, and the outcomes from neuro testing show positive measures, then we could say silence in this application is of a scientific kind. Nevertheless, silence is not just scientific. In education, there is a pressure for any engagement with silence and solitude to prove itself, to have a structure that allows us to recognize it as a knowledge which we can say fits in with a discipline, fits in with a scientific approach of education as improving things. And yet silence itself as a practice and as a pursuit for goodness or for well-being could also be an escape. So this is seen in the context of the idea that everybody has personal issues that could benefit from some form of therapeutic intervention. It is the nature of the human being that as they're growing, they're going to encounter difficulties which could cause trauma, big and small. And at some point, it may be appropriate that they get some help with that, be it self-help or be it a professional therapist. And so in this sense, an IFS, which is what I've mentioned in this abstract, which is the short version of a name for a model called internal family systems. Richard Schwartz, who founded that model, has talked about people escaping their difficulties, their trauma, by going towards meditation, mindfulness, and let's say silence practices as a form of not dealing with their issues, a sort of a bypass, if you like. And what I'm interested in is the fact that silence is a very beautiful situation in so many ways. I mean, I've said in the past, it brings forth benefits if it's not coercive. But at the same time, it's troubled by the fact that we have this internal trauma, which causes ruminations, and we have to fight those things, or we have to deal with those things, either through silence or through other methods. So in other words, silence and self-care can come together and they can form a package which needs attention. And yet silence at the same time is itself a material which is attempting to stop us paying attention to ourselves and moving into a neutral space, shall we say, or a beneficial negative space of no rumination, for example. So there's that puzzle, and it has no structure, in my opinion, and that is itself an issue, because we are by nature creatures who desire to know, and knowledge is formed through structures of understanding. So how do we deal with the fact that silence is itself unstructured, and yet in a context of education it requires to be structured, linked to scientific proofs that it's valuable, and at the same time it is coupled with a need to attend to our inner rumination, our possible traumas that require dealing with, attending to, looking after. For example, one example from the therapeutic domain would be to attend to the voice of our inner child and thereby gain well-being. If inner child is a concept that you're interested in. So the puzzle is our inner resources, or our inner chatter that comes from this traumatic fact of being a human being, or the fact of the trauma of being a human being, is breaking our silence or troubling our silence. It's not an easy thing to achieve. And we need to attend to that, but that stops us being in silence, which stops us getting the benefits. And in all of this, there is also the issue, the puzzle, that silence is something which allows people to be equal. And IFS, as a particular framework, which I think can solve the difficulty of the inner trauma, it's very, in my opinion, a very effective therapeutic intervention, possibly the quickest and the most interesting that there is, in order to move towards the silence in an authentic way, not in a way of an escape. It's expensive, and it's not nothing about equality as far as I can tell, if you're taking it in its full measure, and as they put it, going towards the exiles, which is the source of trauma. You need a therapist, or you need to pay some money, even if it's just to pay money for a book. So silence is completely free, but to deal with your trauma one way or the other, whatever framework you desire, is probably going to cost some money, and that's not about equality. So here we have silence as a benefit, solitude as a benefit, linked to science, linked to structures of knowledge, linked, of course, to the very strong binaries and structures of school as experience, as social dynamic, And then we have the fact of the unstructured voice of the self as a personal self or as a social self. Nothing is structured about that if we encounter it as part of a relationship to trauma, which itself does not have structure, even if it's linked to the seeming structure of memory. So the puzzle is to say silence and solitude are not as clear-cut, in my opinion, as we think they are. And of course, people, I'm about to finish here. So we as people are also extremely complicated. And I think silence and solitude are often positioned, and particularly in education, as some kind of answer to complexity. But what I'm saying is that the relationship that silence and solitude inevitably have to have, if they're not to be an escape mechanism, to dealing with the inner self and its voices that come from the fact of human experience, is a relationship that is not silent, but it has to have some kind of relationship to silence and solitude, because we're not going to ignore those, and we're not going to say that they don't exist. They are fundamentally true and available. So the road is, or the question is, what do we do with this puzzle and this package? Because we cannot be silent about it, and we need, and this is my final, very final comment, we need to discuss it and we need to talk to others, because frankly, nobody seemingly can exit the voices or the cacophony of voices that is their own inner difficulties without the help of others. So in that sense, there's no solitude either.
Thank you, Helen. Especially thank you that you express your ideas and you present your ideas in a very short time, and still showing them in a very interesting way, and underlining this tension between silence and inner trauma and anxiety. Thank you a lot. And I have to ask organizers what to do. Do we have the time for discussion, or we need to have a break? I don't know what to do. I try to follow the time, but I didn't manage. I'm very sorry, Julian. I didn't know how it happened.
It's, oh no, don't worry. It's the fate of all of us in academia. I've lost the ability to remember what it's like having children running for the door when I run over, and I should remember that. I think I'm afraid, for comfort's sake, so that we're able to eat something or whatever, even if it's just to grab something to eat, I think we should break now and come back at 2 o'clock. So we have 10 minutes now. We have a period at the end of the day when we will have some time for discussion then, if people can be saving up their deep questions. I know everyone here would be interested in hearing questions directly, emailing each other or through through myself or the other organisers. But I think, thank you, Helen, it's lovely to see you. I think we should have 10 minutes now, if that's okay with the others.
Okay, so thank you, Julian, for acceptation for my leading the session, and thank you all participants. It was really very. I learned a lot listening to your presentation, and thank you a lot again. And see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Hello, Samir.
Hi, Rafa. How are you?
Oh, very good, thank you. Okay, I will present your presentation. Okay. I try now. Okay.
All right.
Okay, can you see?
I can see it. Yeah, that's fine. Looks
okay.
Good. So there are 5 slides, and then we can just stop the presentation.
Okay. You will tell me next slide, and start the presentation, and will be good.
Okay, thank you. Really appreciate it, Rafa. Nice to meet you. Hello, Julian.
Hello, Samir. Good to see you.
Good to see you again.
I have just, perhaps the rest of the people at the conference don't eat or anything. I've just grabbed something to eat and managed to rush back to my desk just in time, happily, to introduce Samir. Dayal, welcome. It is a minute past 1, so I'm just a minute late. I heard about Samir through a colleague at Bentley University, and I am delighted to, I was delighted to hear about your research and to invite you to join us here. I don't want to, we've been running, as you know, so we're running a little late, so I won't give you a long introduction. You will introduce yourself, I think, and I will, and your work, but I'm so looking forward to hearing about Antigone at the Crossroads. Samir.
Thank you, Julian. I want to begin by thanking you for inviting me to this wonderful conference and to the other conference organizers. It's my first time and I'm really happy to be here. I also want to thank Rafa for agreeing to help me with the slides. There's a little bit of an echo. I'm not sure what that is about. Well, I don't want to say too much by way of introduction. My field is basically post-colonial and post-imperial literatures and psychoanalysis and philosophy. So that's basically where I work. And this is a new topic for me. And you'll see that my focus is basically literary and philosophical. So I'll just begin. Chris Cuomo, the disgraced TV news anchor, describes a monumental struggle with COVID. Hallucinations, sweating at night when the beast comes out, and losing 13 pounds in 3 days. Yet the most painful part of the experience was what Cuomo described as a psychical transformation, feeling hopelessly and terrifyingly alone. It's this psychical dimension, loneliness in its many and varied guises, including alienation, that interests me, because it is a phenomenon both underestimated and at epidemic proportions. What I propose to do here is to note the scale and seriousness of this neglected phenomenon, and then to focus on one classical example of what I'm calling, in a somewhat loose sense, loneliness, to think about how we might cast new light on it. Even if we cannot rid ourselves of it as a problem, we can reperspectivize a better relation to it and to ourselves. As you can see on the slide, a recent study of adults in the United States reported a spike in levels of anxiety and depression during the pandemic. According to a February 2021 Harvard Making Common project, quote, alarming numbers of Americans are lonely. Of 950 American survey respondents, 36% reported feeling lonely frequently or almost all the time or all the time over the preceding month. If you can have the next slide. A startling 61% of young people aged 18 to 25 and 51% of mothers with young children reported miserable degrees of solitude, of loneliness, with, quote, substantial increases in loneliness since the outbreak of the pandemic. Loneliness, as the Harvard study said, is, quote, linked to early mortality and a wide array of serious physical and emotional problems, including depression, anxiety, heart disease, substance abuse, and domestic abuse. The study found that depression and loneliness compound each other and exacerbate other problems. Next slide, please. Even at the start of the pandemic, top health experts published the controversial Great Barrington Declaration, which you see on the screen now, expressing, quote, grave concerns about the projected damaging physical and mental health. These concerns were largely borne out. The pandemic we have endured since 2020 has caused a parallel pandemic of anxiety, depression, and feelings of loneliness. Loneliness and alienation have significant physical and psychical costs, often experienced as painful alienation from community, colleagues, and friends, loss of intimacy, fear of identity-erasing dementia, or the fog of Alzheimer's, and the soul-crushing sense as old age approaches of being alone unto death. In 2017, the AARP, the the American Association of Retired Persons, reported only 14% of older adults in the US as being socially isolated. But they nevertheless, quote, accounted for $6.7 billion in additional Medicare spending. A national survey in August 2020 revealed that under COVID, 61% of those 50 or older reported, quote, experiencing social isolation since the pandemic began. Social isolation is compounded for rural communities. Yet the US healthcare system seldom screens for or discusses social isolation with patients. In yet another study in the Journal of the American Medical Association, or JAMA, Eve Escalante and her co-authors observe that social isolation, defined as, quote, an objective deficit in the number of relationships with and frequency of contact with family, friends, and the community, is associated with increased rates of loneliness and suicide, hypertension, and other physical health effects that may be mediated by neurohormonal immunological pathways. Demonstrated to be as dangerous to health as smoking 15 cigarettes per day, social isolation has been identified as worthy of being a public health priority. While the JAMA study is generally in agreement with the Harvard and AARP studies, the deficit of social isolation it identifies surely is not merely a matter for objective observation. Such a description diverts attention away from the qualitative, even the psychic affect, the subjective experience of loneliness. Significantly, Escalante et al. Do make the important subjective distinction between social isolation and loneliness. And my goal here is to foreground the psychic affect and some of its neglected expressions and ramifications. I don't pretend to be capable of resolving the problem of loneliness any more than I can claim to resolve other hard or even relatively easy problems of consciousness. Seeking resolution, however, may not be the most productive approach to the issue of loneliness and its analogues. My minimalist interest here is not to show how we might cure loneliness, but to suggest that even if we cannot wish it away, we can reframe it and thereby reimagine possible ways of reperspectivizing it, reorienting our attitude to it. Loneliness is an increasingly universal issue, but anxiety, depression, loneliness, even the somewhat distinct alienation in my title, hardly present new crises. In 2018, for instance, the UK appointed a Minister of Loneliness, recognizing the affliction. Similarly, Dr. Vivek Murthy, the Surgeon General of the United States, identified a mental health crisis among America's youth population even before the COVID pandemic. He lead authored a 53-page report on loneliness and alienation, showing depression doubled during the pandemic globally. One could argue that the COVID pandemic did push the epidemic further in the direction of another pandemic. In a recent book called Together, The Healing Power of Human Connection in a sometimes lonely world, Murthy proposes 4 ways of responding positively to the loneliness epidemic. 1, spend time each day with those you love. 2, focus on each other. 3, embrace solitude. 4, help and be helped. These recommendations are fairly standard and unsurprising, except for the third, embrace solitude. Murthy's advice is innocuous enough, but even putting aside for the moment the distinction between solitude and loneliness, just as before I set aside the difference between alienation and loneliness, this recommendation is on the face of it a contradiction of his explicit diagnosis of a loneliness epidemic. The embrace of solitude suggests deliberate choice, even a recognition that solitude is a good thing. And this is what interests me. Why would anybody choose to face separation of self from others? Is anything to be gained? To pursue this nexus of questions, I briefly consider Sophocles' play Antigone as a case study of someone who does embrace loneliness and even self-alienation, though technically solitude is not really a choice open to her. The atypically female tragic heroine Antigone makes the fateful but ethical choice of self-alienation and literally terminal loneliness by openly defying King Creon's order that Polynices' body remain unburied. Polynices and Eteocles, his and Antigone's brother, fought in a mutually fratricidal war over accession to the throne. Polynices was opposed to his uncle Creon's rule, and so Creon refused him a proper burial, while Eteocles, who supported Creon, received full honors. Antigone's criminal but ethical resistance courts expulsion from society and the inevitable death sentence, where she twice casts dirt on Polynices' body, fully aware that this can only be a ritual gesture and not an actual burial. In the first instance, Antigone's choice of a known undesirable can be construed as not mere contradiction, but as a strategic para-consistency, a judicious deliberation to accept contradiction. The play turns on two pivotal structural conflicts. The first is familial, between Antigone's brothers Eteocles and Polynices, who end up killing each other, one defending Creon's rule and the other opposing it. That triggers the second political conflict between Antigone and Creon as sovereign of the city-state. How should we interpret her knowing and willing choice of pariahdom, of loneliness unto death? Antigone's act of self-alienation represents a complex and deliberate ethical response to the contradiction between the political law of Creon and a higher norm. She para-consistently chooses dissidence as an ethical stance, producing a certain aesthetic authenticity and excellence, her shining beauty celebrated by Jacques Lacan. This dissident ethical loneliness is premised on the one hand on authentic subjectivity, and on the other on the state's functioning as an interminable actualization of ethical community, Hegel's Sittlichkeit. My ethical construal of loneliness might seem perverse, at odds with the everyday felt pain of loneliness. If Antigone's loneliness is ethical, it is so in a very different sense from what Jill Stauffer indicates by that phrase in her book bearing that title, Ethical Loneliness. For Stauffer, ethical loneliness is, quote, the isolation one feels when one, as a violated person or as one member of the persecuted group, has been abandoned by humanity or by those who have power over one's life possibilities. So ethical loneliness is the experience of having been abandoned by humanity, compounded by the experience of not being heard, unquote. Stauffer's existential ontological loneliness is a kind of negative kenosis, an emptying of meaning to the point of de-worlding and de-individuation, even as the physical ontic individual may continue to exist like an empty shell. My own framing of Antigone's performative constitutes an ontological opposition. Antigone is authentic in the specifically Heideggerian sense, positing a distinction between mere ontic existence and ontological being, the authentic ontological Dasein that poses the very question of being. Antigone is, as Lacan puts it, between two deaths. And it is in that suspension that she raises the question of being by making her ethical and doomed stand. My intention is not to discredit Stauffer's important highlighting of the existential destitution of meaningful life. I invoke her identical phrasing to put in relief my diametrically opposed framing of ethical. Further, I interpret loneliness in a motivatedly catachristical way. Loneliness not as passive or privative, but as affirmative negation and critical self-alienation. And if ethical loneliness in Stauffer's terms is the public feeling of abandonment by humanity, I am foregrounding the private counterpart, as illustrated, and Rafai, could you put up the next slide, please? As illustrated in the feeling of destitution by a loved one's death, elegically registered by W.H. Auden in the lines from Funeral Blues excerpted here. The stars are not wanted now. Put out every one. Pack up the moon and dismantle the sun. Pour away the ocean and sweep up the wood. For nothing now can ever come to any good. Thank you, Raphael. That should do it, if you could. Thanks. Linda Finlay offers a similar private autoethnography describing her psychological isolation, aloneness, and even alienation from the land of the living, as she puts it, when she succumbed to COVID. Even as she recovers, she reflects on the psychological effects of the trauma. And I quote her here, "I have an inkling now of how a leper must feel," unquote. The difference in Antigone's case with all the cases I've been looking at so far is that Antigone's private subjective self-positioning assumes its full meaning only in the broader context of ethical community or Sittlichkeit, as I will argue below. Again, my aim is not merely to displace or diminish the real sense of existential loneliness many people do experience in everyday life. Indeed, I began this talk with a discussion of this critical issue. My point is to explore a somewhat characteristic construal of loneliness as an ethical choice, and to assay the virtues of a chosen loneliness as a negation that permits an affirmation of human freedom. I am not the first person to discuss the virtues of choosing to embrace loneliness. Clark E. Moustakis foregrounds the positive valence of loneliness, emphasizing that, quote, "every man is alone. Ultimately, each person exists in isolation. Yet it is in this that he or she can work towards the, quote, realization of his own capacities. In loneliness, man seeks the fulfillment of his inner nature," unquote, and may thus experience, quote, "a new compassion and new beauty," close quote. It is in this sense that we might understand what I am calling the freedom and beauty embodied in Antigone, her ontological authenticity. Antigone's deliberate and elective self-separation from her society does result in loneliness unto death, but it confirms Moustakis' reframing of loneliness as capable of producing authenticity and even beauty. Antigone finds herself compelled to choose the ethical option, even if it makes her terminally and fatally alienated. This is an ironic commentary on the status of democratic values in this culture, values such as equality. Furthermore, Antigone's ethical choice is gendered. It ironizes such democratic categories as equality by recasting democracy intersectionally. Excuse me. Her loneliness is gender-coded in her odd behavior and even her language, as Mark Griffith notes. Quote, "The language in which Antigone expresses herself is highly individual and strangely contradictory. At the same time, both manly and feminine, dutiful and transgressive, visionary and narrow-minded. Antigone bears the stigmata, the ate or doom of her kinship relation to the line of Oedipus." I'm still quoting him. "Besides Antigone's erotic or quasi-erotic, quote, fixation on her brother and father, her desire to please them and to be with them at all costs is recognized by everyone in this play as yet another manifestation of forbidden inward turning on the part of this unique/typical family," unquote. Griffith also notes that Antigone's choice to bury her brother and face the consequences is obviously represented as, quote, "a conscious decision," and she explains and defends it rationally in terms of divine sanctions and family loyalty, though simultaneously her language is infiltrated throughout by, quote, "a cluster of desires and feelings that are less rationally defensible, less fully articulated, and less fully conscious, yet no less strong or determinative of her feelings and actions," unquote. The important question of kinship and Antigone's gendered disaffection, resistance, and alienation arises here for many feminists such as Luz Irigaray, Judith Butler, and Andrea Cavarero. Irigaray, for instance, sees in the relationship of the siblings Antigone and Polynices an idealized modular form of the relation between female and male citizen subjects of the Greek polis, quote, a dialectic produced by the discourse of patriarchy, unquote. Antigone's problematic family legacy, she is the exile Oedipus's daughter and inherits her father's sins. This legacy does put her in a special and gendered kind of position within the normative structure. She is simultaneously a privileged and prominent figure within it and the constitutive abject excess that cannot be incorporated. My argument, extending Butler's, is that Antigone's performative is extimate, to use Lacan's word, the psychoanalytic term, extimate in a normative sense. Antigone is both within kinship norms. She participates in ethical life that is contingent on kinship relations and simultaneously transgresses those norms, entering into fatal ethical loneliness. Antigone's embodied gendered performative necessitates exit from shared sociality. The chorus and even Antigone herself cry out that her act of resistance is criminal. The Greek word is panorgesasa. Yet her loneliness starkly heightens the drama of her access to an ethical freedom. Her loneliness is not existential loneliness, but rather the complicated choice of a free ethical subject. Freedom here should not be romanticized as liberal subjectivity or autonomous self-construction in a social vacuum, but instead situated within Sittlichkeit. Antigone's choice not only transforms the affective quality of her loneliness, but also transforms what Heidegger calls the moodedness, Stimmung, of her life world, the particular affective way, Befindlichkeit, in which the world is disclosed, erschlossen, to the subject as Dasein. As Matthew Ratcliffe suggests, there can be, quote, profound alterations in the structure of experience that are usually associated with anomalous feelings. Indeed, these feelings often seem to be inseparable from distortions and diminutions of a sense of reality and of belonging to a world, unquote. It is this de-worlding and re-worlding, this transvalued moodedness of the world that Antigone traverses. This amounts to a negative freedom. It is through alienation, negation, that the individual becomes a self-conscious, reflexive subject. Hegel implies that Greek Sittlichkeit, ethical community, does not accede to the negativity of self-alienation, which is the crucial point. Without the negative, Sittlichkeit cannot come into its ethical completion. For Hegel, Sittlichkeit is historicized, contingent, but the universal ethical law is nevertheless expressed within Sittlichkeit as springing organically, as it were, from within the ethical subject, the particular individual. And this is where Antigone is special as a Greek heroine. As J.M. Bernstein puts it, quote, in the phenomenology of spirit, Hegel makes Antigone the hero of the chapter on spirit, its progressive movement terminating in a vindication of her defiant criminal transgression of Creon's law, prohibiting the burial of her brother Polynices. Her criminality, her transgressiveness, and her work of negation are for Hegel what, in their necessity and inevitability, require acknowledgement and legitimation. She is the force of the negative, unquote. The freedom attained by negation, by the de-worlding and re-worlding of Antigone's habitus, is premised on a fundamental intersubjectivity, Sittlichkeit. Her self-alienation is a normative, performative, an ethical insistence on posing a competing and just norm against Creon's arbitrarily imposed diktat. While in one sense Antigone, as a powerless woman, is entirely without choice, unfree, there is undeniably something agential and free about her choosing what even her sister Ismene is not brave enough to choose: exile from society and certain death. Creon too must encounter a terrible loneliness, univocally and unidimensionally tragic, an emptying of meaning, of kenosis, in contrast with Antigone. He too arrives at a state of existential loneliness at the end of the play, when his daughter-in-law-to-be is dead, but so is his son and his wife. But Antigone's choice is admirable because she chooses freely and remains resolute in her ethical loneliness, what Aristotle might have called her hexis. The ethical hexis revealed in her performative corresponds to the ancient Greek category of parrhesia, what Michel Foucault characterizes as defined by truth-telling and risk. This term is etymologically linked to the larger category of freedom. Parrhesia means, quote, speaking everything freely, unquote. Although Antigone might not accede to that kind of freedom, eleftheria, or the self-sufficiency, autarkeia, of the Greek cynic Parrhesiastes Diogenes, she does accede to what I am calling ethical loneliness. Even in cases where freedom is not exactly a matter of choice, there can be, ironically, a liberatory aspect to loneliness. In Franz Kafka's classic, The Metamorphosis, Gregor Samsa turns into an insect, and without having choice in the matter, his world is deworlding. He is isolated not only from the world, but also freed from it. His work, responsibilities, and family no longer press on him. Gregor's world has been transvalued, mooded differently, to riff on Heidegger's term. Kafka metamorphoses the negative affect, loneliness, into something markedly different, and I would say even life-affirming, quite literally. A key element of this metamorphosis of moodedness becomes evident in a final passage in the story when Gregor's sister greets a new day, as if Gregor's pain and suffering no longer mattered, even to Kafka himself. And his parents too feel a load has been lifted off their shoulders, and they are free to live again. So why study Antigone now? I suggest that the play presents a case study to revisit for our own time crucial questions about democratic freedom, when democracy is itself at risk around the globe, including at the hands of autocrats who recall Creon's aggressive assertion of masculinist power. Antigone's act of resisting Creon's imposed law is itself a normative intervention, as I have argued. It is also a defense of a radically democratic exercise of freedom, profoundly ethical. Sophocles' play returns us to the question of humanism, which, as political scientist Bonnie Honig points out, is making a comeback, though not the rationalist, universalist variety discredited by post-structuralism and the horrific events of the 20th century, but a newer variant, one that reprises an earlier humanism in which what is common to humans is not rationality, but the ontological fact of mortality, finitude. Not the capacity to reason, but vulnerability to suffering. We are not talking here only or specifically about modern democracy, and the homeostasis of democratic order must not be imagined in our contemporary sense. Yet even in a modern idiom, Antigone's extimate alienation presents a critical problem for democracy and civil society. Thus, even a contemporary author such as Ursula Le Guin can pose a discomforting question in The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Is it ironically a symptom of democracy that someone must be abjected, othered, denied citizenship or rights, walked away from, that someone has to be constitutively excluded? Ethical exclusion from a group may take the form of negating the demos, but here exclusion has a certain democratic force of normativity. Antigone's alienated freedom is political freedom, a disaffection from a political authoritarian law. My own discussion asks the related question: is Antigone's ethical loneliness necessary for the constitution of that from which loneliness is abstracted as constitutive? A final movement of tragedy requires that the tragic hero must endure becoming a scapegoat. So that tragic catharsis can be achieved and order restored, Antigone's alienation from her ethical community, though tragic, is also the condition for the restitution of Sittlichkeit. At the tragedy's conclusion, normalcy must be reinstated. But is this reinstatement itself necessarily the eternal recurrence of the same? Tina Chanto calls for, quote, redrawing of the lines of the polity so that it no longer is able to cast her out as it's excluded outside, unquote. Antigone is the constitutively excluded element of the polity. But is it too utopian to imagine a democratic principle that is no longer premised on the constitutive abjection and exclusion of an other, diagnosed not only in Le Guin's Omelas, but also in the works of Afro-pessimists such as Frank B. Wilderson and David Marriott, as well as Christina Sharp and others. My proposition here is that given the conditions, loneliness, if ethically chosen, can open to yet unrealized possibilities and democratic futures. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you. Goodness me, we've had a lot to think about today already, and you have just opened up a whole extra layer of interest, for which I'm enormously grateful. I wonder if there are any questions. I, as always, keep thinking of questions, but I would like someone else, if they would like to ask a question. I was roughly within a century or two, at the same time as Sophocles was writing Antigone, the Bhagavad Gita was being written, in which the god figure Krishna advises Arjuna, the human hero, that he shouldn't bother, that he's going to fight his own family, his own teachers in a war. He should, it's actually a very masculine demand that he should, in modern and in ancient parlance, I think grow a pair or something like that, that he should be more a man, should withdraw into himself and statically, should withdraw from the world in order to be prepared to fight the battles that must be fought. And I'm torn between thinking that's the same story as Antigone or the opposite, because it is a withdrawal, a separation, a lone, a self-willed alienation, if you like, but it is seen as a more comfortable one, not a tragic one, but a withdrawing so that one can do one's duty, as it were, in a way that isn't strenuous, isn't a battle, isn't a Hegelian battle. I don't know if you're familiar with the account, but also which side of that you would fall on. Is it the opposite story or the same story?
It's a continuous story. I mean, I would argue that apart from the masculinism of the two cases, the connection that I really see there is that for both Antigone and for Krishna, the lesson to be learned is that, as the Gita says, the advice comes in the form of this lesson that it is an illusion to think that you are doing the killing. You are not actually the killer, so you have to do your duty. And this kind of notion of duty and doom are paired also in the mind of Antigone, that she is actually operating under the aegis of a higher law than Creon's. Similarly, Krishna's advice to Arjuna is that he should do his duty and just fight the fight, even though he's killing his own brothers, because it is an illusion to think that he is doing the killing. It is beyond him, and he is simply an actor in a much larger cosmic design. And so there's a sense that you are also freed from a kind of personal, individual, anarchic kind of action. So there's a continuity there. There's higher sense of, what the Roman philosophers would call virtù, which kind of brings in the gender dimension, but also brings in the question of a higher virtue. So in that sense, there's a kind of continuity among these ancient cultures where the truly virtuous act is at the same time part of an ethical community, Sittlichkeit or Arte or whatever. And also it is realized organically, as it were, from within the individual. it's that connection, that kind of dialectic that I think Hegel is glomming onto, but he comes to it pretty late in the day, of course. But yes, I mean, I think the Bhagavad Gita's that crucial. I mean, remember that this is a lesson being delivered to the doubtful, the self-doubting warrior on the field of battle. It's in the middle of the battle that they pause the action, as in a stop motion or something, and have this kind of philosophical dialogue, which is wonderful. So I hope that that helps to answer your question, Julian.
Thank you. Well, it keeps me thinking. I was wondering if Jarek Horowski, who's written about the need to be prepared to be lonely, if you have, to the extent that you have principles and values, being prepared to be lonely, to follow those through, is itself a moral strength. And I'm not, I hope I'm getting that right, Jarek, but as he's here at the conference, I was wondering if that has a, if what you were saying has an echo in Jarek's work. Well, I'd put that forward anyway, that's the value of, it's not the value of loneliness itself, it's the value of being prepared to be lonely. As with, if you have a group of friends and they want to do something that you don't approve of, you may have to be prepared to be lonely, have that strength in order to maintain your position, your ethics, your values, and so on.
I mean, that's the other meaning of ethos, right? The kind of the individual's formation as a kind of preparedness, you know, semper paratus or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. Do we have any questions or comments? If you can put your electronic hand up, or frankly, if you just want to turn your microphone on and call out. Alex.
I would like to say thank you because you remind us of Kafka and his metamorphosis, and for me it's a beginning of the 20th century. As a person from Central Europe or Central Eastern Europe, let's say, Kafka is so important. And Emi, hour ago, was mentioned about Italo Calvino, and it's another really outstanding author. And for me, this pair, Kafka and Calvino, are a beginning and the end of 20th century in our culture, let's say. So thank you very much.
Oh, sorry, Olga. Olga, hello. I didn't see your hand there, and I see Henrietta's hand as well. Now all the questions are coming. Yes. Olga, would you like to ask a question? You're muted, so I can't hear you if you're asking. Shall I move on to the second person? I'll come back to you, Olga, if you're unable to unmute for a while. Henrietta?
Yes, hello again. I just wanted to thank you for this wonderful lecture. It's more of a comment and not a question per se. It's a comment starting from this gratitude. It gives my own presentation a much wider scope and perspective. I was talking about fulfilling subjectiveness in a way of Heideggerian perspective, but also a phenomenological analysis of intent, intention, intentionality. the very fact that we are so interested today in this tragedy, or in this in this lesson of duty, it goes against the idea that our times are totally deprived of compass or of an ethical orientation. We are still guided by ethics, and it's still the lesson of duty. It's still a very moving one. And even the recent war proved that people are have deep resources, and they are very generous to relate to their peers beyond any politics and any other considerations. Just I'm talking about the Russian war against Ukraine, and the fact that Polish people were so generous in supporting their peers, and also instances of this sort of spontaneous reaction happened in Romania as well. And I think with each occasion, the human being overcomes the comfort of daily life and raises to the call of duty, even today, when we thought our times are so superficial and so linear in a way. So thank you. Your speech was, your presentation was very rich. The analysis and the correlation between Greek philosophy and feminism, they are so interesting. And I wanted to ask you if you kindly would like to share with me your bibliography.
Sure, I can do that.
Very interesting for me to see there are lots of contemporary sources that I don't know, and I found out about them from your speech. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Henrietta. I was listening to your speech, although it was very early for me here in Boston. I listened to your speech this morning, your talk this morning, and found it very engaging as well. Yeah, so I was thinking of when I was talking about Creon, I was thinking about Putin and Zelensky, and of course, you know, I find that Antigone's lesson is valuable for our time as well. So thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Thank you indeed. And Piotr Domeracki has his hand. You have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question, Piotr?
Yes. Thank you, Julian. Yeah, thank you, Samir, for your very interesting and inspiring speech. There is something astonishing about morality in general. I would call it an internal contradiction or dialectic, if you like. On the one hand, the task of morality is to build community. On the other hand, following morality turns out to expose us as individuals in society just to alienation. And there is also a second bottom to this issue, namely official morality, obligatory in society and personal morality based on our intimate voice of conscience. And there is often a, how to say, paradoxical conflict between these two, even though we are still talking about, in these two cases, about morality. In this sense, as to me, morality turns out to be a puzzling phenomenon which on the one hand, unites us, gathering together into a society, and on the other hand, it includes us into separate individual beings. It does, however, unite through the subordination of individuals to the generally accepted norms of society, and on the other hand, it excludes us when we as individuals do not submit to this moral pressure from the uniform morality of society. And I am interested in your opinion on this difficult relationship. Thank you for the possibility of taking part into the interesting discussion.
Thank you, Piotr. That's such a thoughtful and rich question. So as I see it, there are two contradictions that you rightly point to. One is the contradiction between the kind of internal morality as participation in society, what I called ethical community, and our exposure as an individual, as separating from that. These are both moments of morality, but they're contradictory. And then there's a second kind of contradiction between the conscience, which is a totally different animal, and a kind of received morality. So you've got two different kinds of contradictions within morality. And I find that that is what I was trying to get at with this notion of the ethical, because ethical, as I see it, is both ethos, the Greek individual, and then you've got the question of the subject, which is another complicating business. The citizen and the subject are not always identical. So what I meant by invoking the question of the ethical is, first of all, to bring in this this kind of deconstructed notion of the individual ethos, and the question, this very vexed question of morality. So this is what I meant when I talked about Antigone's extimate connection to the world in which he lives. The term I'm borrowing from Jacques Lacan suggests as an amoebius strip that one is both within and without, external to and internal to the ethical community at the same time. So there's a kind of virtuous interpretation of this. That is to say, one is always, if one is thoughtful and careful, one is always both within and outside of society. If one is thinking like Antigone, you are always extimate in that sense. So there's a kind of virtuous self-positioning as both being included and excluded in the kind of double contradiction that we were talking about earlier. But there's also a kind of vicious exclusion that I wanted to bring up when I mentioned Le Guin. That is to say, does democracy depend on somebody being excluded? That is to say, can we imagine a democracy in which we do not walk away from somebody who is left in the margins? Or does the civil society, ironically, depend on the abjection of somebody, the lowering of somebody so that other people can rise? So this is the kind of virtuous exclusion that I want to talk about, in addition to the virtuous inclusion or exclusion that democracy seems to require. So this is, I know, a mess of questions, but I'm trying to untangle these so that I can ask the question, what do we do if we want to reimagine democracy in a way that does not exclude women, subalterns, Jews, or what have you? You know, how can we imagine a truly democratic spirit, not just a kind of political a polis, but even the Greek polis excluded slaves, for example. The whole question of the citizen depends on exclusion. The ballot box in ancient Greece said that some people had stones to put in the jar and other people did not have the stones. It depended on property. It depended on your genitalia. So I'm just saying that how can we think about equality, equity, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, in a spirit where exclusion is no longer part of the logic, or is that an inescapable part of the dialectic, that there is always going to be an exclusion without which you cannot have the thing. In other words, there's always going to be a symptom that is excluded by the logic of the construction. I'll just stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you beautifully for your reply. Yeah, thank you.
I love it when an answer raises so many questions as well. That's fascinating. Are there other people who would like to comment? I'm sorry, I'm looking at my lists. Throughout today, if I was going to pick there isn't a theme, but going to pick a theme, it would be the contradictions and ambiguities. I think Hegel might have enjoyed today the dialectic of opposites, of privacy and public, of going into yourself in order to follow a bigger duty than a national duty. So the big and the small, how to use a unapologetic National Socialist philosopher, as we had this morning, or how to read actively. And Kate Vronska, you have a question. Hello, Kate. I don't think I've seen you. I don't think I've seen you on video yet today. Would you like to ask?
Oh, thank you, Julian, and thank you, Samir. I'm not sure if my question is relative to your presentation, because I'm not sure if I caught your thought precisely, but if I understood it, I have the question, because I'm not sure if I well understood your words. I'm not sure if solitude, no solitude, if loneliness connected with alienation, it is very interesting for me. But if we connect loneliness with alienation, and you suggest this is a chance. This is a chance for our times, democratic times of autocracy and voice of majority, and you maybe you suggest it is among ethical experience, alienation and loneliness. I have problem with this, because in my thinking about morality, about ethics, I see loneliness as such negative experience that it is task for me, for people, to help a person who feels lonely. So I can't see loneliness as a chance, and test for this is my profession as a philosopher of education. And when I value something, I always try to see it in the sphere of children life. And I can't see and I can't put loneliness as an experience in child life, because I can't agree for this. So my question is, sorry for so long speech from my side. I would like to ask you, what do you think about this your reflection on alienation and exclusion and and loneliness? What do you think about these experiences in children life? Is it acceptable for children perspective?
Thank you, Kate, for that wonderful question. First of all, I have the deepest respect for what you're saying. I think it's very important to remember that, first of all, loneliness is a painful experience for most people. And that's why I spent so much time in the beginning of the talk talking about loneliness as being a kind of affliction, a kind of problem that people are rightly trying to alleviate for many people. So especially with children, I mean, loneliness is very often a very negative, very sad kind of state to be in. And I admire people like you who try to help children, of course. What I was trying to suggest in my paper is that I want to think about reperspectivizing loneliness in a kind of catachresis, if you understand that term as a kind of rhetorical gesture. I'm trying to read it against the grain so that perhaps we can understand something like what Amy was saying so eloquently earlier when she was talking about children and their reading alone. So they do feel lonely because they feel sort of cut off from other kids. But there is something valuable about that. You know, maybe if you think about something like Wordsworth's line, "I wandered lonely as a cloud." I mean, that's not just a single negative state. Even in that feeling lonely, specifically lonely, there is something to be gained by a kind of communion with oneself. Mustakas, whom I quoted in my talk, suggests that being actually lonely might return us from our vain sort of delusions and illusions about the world and really get us in sync with ourselves. So I'm just trying to read it against the grains without having any kind of intention to diminish the real pain that children and grown-ups also feel. So that's there. I also want to say that I guess the reason I'm invoking these very different terms, solitude, loneliness, alienation, disaffection, is partly because I'm thinking about some, the kind of line of thinking that goes through Marx, through Adorno, this idea that that negation and the negation of negation are actually very valuable thinking tools. And so the negation that is implicit in loneliness can become a tool. The negative that is encoded into alienation and self-alienation. In Marx, for example, alienation becomes a kind of positive because alienation allows you to step away from the bourgeois illusion. And only there do you get the revolution. Without alienation, there is no revolution. This is also the case with Hegel and Heidegger, especially Hegel. So I'm hoping that people like you who do such important work with children and adults in terms of alleviating pain can also tolerate a kind of catachristical against the grain reading of loneliness and understand that there is also another dimension. You know, it's the other side of the coin, if you like. There is no black without white. There is no something without the nothing, as the Bhagavad Gita would say. The nothingness always travels with the something. There is no thing without the nothing. Does that make sense?
But is it ethical? Is it ethical?
Oh, yes. Good. Okay. So ethical. So ethical, yes. So as I was saying earlier in response to Piotr's question, I'm trying to read ethical also in a double sense. That is to say, ethical is, first of all, a question. What's the right thing to do? Anyone who asks that question is being ethical. Just to ask the question. If Putin were to ask the question, is it ethical to bomb children, hospitals, pregnant women? Is it ethical? If to ask that question would require him to take it seriously, and he would have to transvalue himself. Zelensky is asking that question. Is it ethical to leave the city, or is it ethical to stay and risk my life in this moment? And he's just an actor, but he's sort of his fiction is preceding and determining his reality. So I'm just saying that there's that piece of ethical. The other thing about ethical is that it's about the self, the individual. So when I say ethical loneliness, I'm talking about this kind of possibility, or the door that opens, or the window that opens even for a child when he or she suffers loneliness, the possibility of communing with oneself. It's ethical in the sense that it returns you to your ethos. It asks you, who are you? Who are you in the world? What is your world? How do you world your world? How do you, as Heidegger would put it, how do you world your world? How do you become an authentic Dasein? That's the question, right? If you do not ask the question, you are merely ontic. You're just a thing. But it's only when you ask the question of being that you become ethical.
Wow. And
right. But we have positive experience, and we have proposition offer for the child. We can speak. You have yourself. This is not all loneliness. This is solitude. This is the solitude.
Right. Yes.
That's
yes, and I think Malka is wanting to agree. I would say, incidentally, it is not ethical to say to a lonely child, you are wrong to be lonely. You shouldn't be lonely. It's fair to say to a child, yeah, it's fair to say to a child, yes, I would be lonely in those circumstances too. Let's see what we can do, because some children grow up thinking loneliness is more of a sin, is itself a sin more than a emotion. It will be painful, just as bereavement is painful, and we may learn from it or do something. But Malka, sorry, I'm fascinated by that issue. So I think there are ethical ways of acknowledging loneliness without encouraging it. Malka.
First of all, I want to thank Katarzyna. Katarzyna, yes, yeah, that's your name. For your remark. I am a psychologist, so I'm moving. I'm not a philosopher, and I have a wonderful day today. And I was exposed to lots of knowledge that I was not aware to. And first of all, thank you very much for a great, very interesting, educating day. My feeling is, Samir, yes, my feeling is that when we are saying that we can remodel or restructure